Welcome back to another teacher training video from Pentecostal Publishing House. My name is Leanne Alexander. Today we're talking about a very important topic, and so with us we have a special guest, Brother Eric Morley. Welcome. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Well, I'm very glad to be here. I work at Pentecostal Publishing House. I help lead our finance and operations team. I've been here for about 7 years at headquarters, and I also am a licensed attorney. I am in the United States Air Force. I've been on active duty. I'm now in the reserve, and as part of that legal work that I do in the military, I prosecute and also have defended cases where someone was accused of various types of misconduct, whether that was including cases of child abuse and sexual abuse and things like that. And so then I also teach a little bit with Urshan College. I'm an adjunct professor there and teach a class on church and nonprofit law. And I've also been involved in a couple of different areas of local church ministry, including to help teach a junior high Sunday school class.
Certainly. Well, I wanted you to share that background because today's topic is something that we've been wanting to talk about for a long time. For those of you who watch these videos every month as we release something new, you hear a lot of the nuts and bolts of working with children's classes, with adults, with any age level. When we get into some of the teaching techniques for use in the classroom, and that's certainly important. But we also have had many requests recently for some help to address some of the risks and liabilities that are associated with the operation of a church. And that does apply to us in the teaching ministry as we are entrusted to care for children, youth, adults. And so given your background and the things you've just shared, I really am excited to hear today some things that will help our teachers and our teaching ministries. So I guess maybe we could just get started with this idea of risks that somewhat inherit as being part of a church and being a volunteer. So maybe talk to us there.
I think that's a good introduction because a church is like any other organization, like a business or community group. And by the very nature of the type of activities and the type of work that it does, there is legal risk and legal liability. And when we say liability, we're referring to just anything that could happen that could result in a lawsuit or could result in an insurance claim because maybe someone got hurt or there was some sort of detrimental situation like that. And so in churches, you see two areas where there is the greatest risk or the most common risk of liability. One would be a situation of child abuse or exploitation. And then the second would be where a child is injured, or really it could be anybody, a child or an adult is injured as a result of a church activity or a church program that they're directly involved in, or even riding in a church vehicle to an activity or something like that. So those are kind of some of the liabilities that churches can face. And again, they're similar to what any type of organization, whether it's a business or a nonprofit entity, might encounter.
Right, that's very good. I don't think we think about those kinds of things that often. We get so busy into the nuts and bolts of teaching, but this is a helpful conversation to back up a step and think about all of those different factors. Maybe talk to us a little bit about some reasons that we should start thinking about risks and ways that we can approach that.
Well, because risk exists, just the mere fact of existence and of engaging in ministry and in activity, there's going to be risk involved. And so you can completely eliminate risk by just doing nothing, by shutting the ministry down, by shutting the activities down. But of course, we can't really live in the world day to day like that. And so risk management is recognizing that these risks, that these liabilities are out there, and instead of ignoring them, being proactive and saying, is there a way we can reduce them or manage them? Is there a way that we can take positive steps to reduce the likelihood of a problem emerging?
That's excellent, excellent. Well, we certainly don't want to just say, well, we can't do anything. We know we want to minister. We have to be active. So maybe then lead us into some specifics about that.
Well, and in terms of specifics, it's important, too, to recognize the breadth of consequences that can happen if a church or a ministry finds itself with somebody who's gotten hurt. There are, of course, if someone is victimized to whatever level you're talking about, as a result of an accident or as a result of some sort of targeted abuse, you have that tremendous impact upon that victim, that injured person, and potentially their family. And so that can involve emotional impact, that can involve psychological damage or psychological difficulty. It can involve spiritual impact. People can feel alienated from the church because this situation has happened to them at the church or connected to the church. And then, of course, if someone is injured or something like that, there can also be the physical impact. So you have very real-world, tangible consequences. Now, for the church itself, if there's a lawsuit, if there's an insurance claim, if attorneys are involved, I mean, the fees and the expenses can go up very quickly. So there can be a financial impact. And then if you think of the larger community or the context that the church is sitting in, a problem can result in damage to the church's reputation, a loss of credibility in the community where the church is sitting, and negative publicity for the church. And maybe we've all seen examples of this in the news, online or in the newspaper, where a church was somehow involved in something where someone was hurt or mistreated, and as a result, it damaged the reputation of that church somehow in the community.
Sure, even for leaders that are involved and have to go through something that difficult. That's such a trying situation. I can imagine.
Yeah, and on the leadership side, even if, say, it's something that happens distinct within the children's ministry, for that church leader at the pastoral level, when these, problems sometimes happen in the church, it can result in a loss of faith and credibility for the leader. It can result in people splitting in their opinion, and that can lead to divided loyalties, a lack of unity. People end up leaving the church, unfortunately, in some situations. And so it can have consequences that are both immediate, but then also that are down the road for the health of the church.
Absolutely. So this is a serious issue. We want to make it clear that this is something that you need to think about. This is a conversation all churches need to have. So let's then talk about some steps to address all of this.
So I think the way to reduce risk is to divide it between some strategic steps that are really big picture, and then some more practical ones that can be implemented immediately or that are a lot more tangible day to day. So when we're talking about strategic steps to reduce risk, the first, I think, is to ensure that the church or the ministry has a climate of awareness and communication. So we want to let people know that we value their safety. We want to let people know that we're taking seriously the safety of their children or their loved ones. That's part of how we value them as a member of our church, of our ministry. The second thing from a strategic level is to build a culture of prevention. So how do you build a culture of prevention? I think there's some important things. They're not always easy, but one is accountability. If there's instances of someone who's doing something wrong, if they are doing something in terms of a church program or activity that's creating an increased risk, that's an inherently dangerous type of activity, you need to address that. You need to hold that person accountable. If they're doing something that is violating, say, certain lines of appropriateness, maybe they've not done anything that's actually now criminal, or maybe they've not done actually something that you can say that was distinctly immoral. But they're taking some steps that seem like they are walking up to those lines, or they're exploring the boundaries of those lines. I think it's important to have accountability at that point, and accountability that's not vague or diplomatic necessarily, but that is clear and is upfront and is confrontational. Because at the end of the day, these are souls and these are hearts that we're trying to guard and protect. And so I think that demands a very clear response. And so by having that accountability is important to build a culture of prevention.
That makes me think of the word proactive. There are some areas of the church where maybe if we're running behind with planning the next event or something like that, the consequences of not being proactive in some areas of ministry, it's not a big deal. Maybe the event doesn't come off as successfully as we'd like, but there are ways we do church where technically we can get by sometimes with a less than our best effort. But I think when we're talking about issues like this where there's risk involved, in this specific instance you've brought up, if there is a volunteer or someone involved that you're beginning to see signs of concern, I think that's a great point to be proactive and address the appropriate the behavior, whatever.
And you have to use wisdom, obviously. Within the context here, there's all sorts of situations we can't even begin to imagine what all they would be. But generally, I would say it'd probably be appropriate to ensure the pastor is informed, that the pastor is part of that conversation, that the children's ministry director, whatever those levels of oversight and accountability are in your local context, make sure they're brought into the conversation. I think one of the ways you can ask yourself, do we have a culture of accountability, is this question of, do the children and the adults connected with our church and with our ministry, do they feel safe to come forward and to say, hey, I've seen something or I've observed something that is wrong, that was unsafe, or that was uncomfortable, or that was maybe inappropriate, or I just have a question.
Right.
I'm not even sure, but I have a question about, do we have that kind of environment where we have that level of safety where people understand that their concerns are going to be taken seriously? They will be believed, if they feel like they've seen something or something has happened that was inappropriate or unsafe, that their concerns are going to be validated and addressed. And I think that's an important part of that culture of prevention. The last thing on the strategic side that I would say is to ensure that there is training on prevention of injuries, on risk management, and on child abuse recognition, recognizing it, and then also, of course, preventing it. And so there's a couple of ways to do that training. There are different national conferences and seminars that are held nationally and throughout the country. And so perhaps attending, having some key leaders or staff or volunteers attend that can be good. And then even within your local context, if you have a children's ministry training weekend, or you have a children's ministry training event, or just part of your normal week-to-week kind of check-in with your teachers, your volunteers, is to have someone from a local community group. There are community groups that are involved in everything from child abuse prevention, your local police departments, counseling agencies. There are in some communities, there are actually nonprofit organizations that assist in what they call forensic interviewing. So if a child has come forward and said, hey, I was harmed in this particular way, they're trained in how to talk to those children at their level to get that type of information. So sometimes those organizations will provide training. And I think, too, that then goes back to that culture of prevention. It kind of puts the church on notice, the people who would come to the church on notice that, hey, we take the safety and the security of our children and of our ministry very seriously.
Excellent, excellent. I recognize that in the short amount of time we have, we can't be completely exhaustive.
Sure.
But I appreciate the mention of these resources. Within a given state, laws could be different in terms of mandatory reporting and any number of things.
Right.
But finding out within your particular community the resources available to you, that's a great point to connect that back to that, creating that entire church culture of awareness. Mm-hmm. And so that's excellent, excellent. So we've talked strategy then. Perhaps take us in the direction of some practical approaches as well.
I've got about 7 steps I would recommend that a church take at the local level, and that are more of the practical of implementing some of those more strategic imperatives we talked about. One would be certainly for paid staff, key leaders, and I would even recommend even for volunteers that are directly involved in the care of children, is have a background check. You've got to make sure that you know whether or not they've ever had any adverse interaction with law enforcement, whether or not they've ever had an arrest or a conviction, especially for something related to the harm or exploitation of minors. So the background checks, I would say, is something that is an absolute must, and then even at the volunteer level if they're involved with ministering directly to children. Another thing is something called the 2-adult rule. So that's just a church rule or a church policy or a practice that says anytime we have children gathered together for ministry, we're going to have at least 2 adults in the room. And that's to protect that teacher or that volunteer from unjust accusation. That's to protect the young people from any type of circumstance. I mean, that's just for safety. If they had to evacuate a room all of a sudden because there was a fire or something like that, having enough adults to make sure that those needs and concerns can be taken care of is a good bright line rule to have in place. For children's ministry such as Sunday school or children's church, where you've got children being dropped off, a lot of churches are doing a check-in procedure where an adult, a parent, a grandparent, a guardian is dropping off that child. Then maybe they get a receipt back from the check-in station, and then in order for that child to be released at the end of the program, that guardian, that parent has to present that receipt to get their child back. Of course, the larger and the more complex the church, the more important these things are because you don't always recognize the family member. So again, in every context, the implementation of that could be a little bit unique, but the idea is what adult has dropped off that particular child for the ministry event, and then you verify that child is being released back to that same adult at the end of the program.
Very good.
Another thing, just a very practical thing, a lot of churches on the church campus have parts of the facility that are used during a portion of the church service or the event, and then are not used later. So just a standard example might be you have Sunday school at 10, and then at 11 o'clock, everybody goes to the sanctuary for the morning worship service. Well, something simple like having an usher or a security person or a ministry director go through the educational wing, go through the classrooms, go through those areas of the church that were being used for kids ministry, and just make sure, hey, is everybody out? There's no kids left behind, there's no adults left behind, and then go ahead and lock those doors, secure them, again, appropriate with proper fire code requirements and things like that to ensure that people can leave the building if needed, but just to make sure that those areas that aren't being used have been secured so you're not giving any opportunity for anything bad to happen, someone being abused, but even someone getting into stuff they shouldn't and getting hurt.
Sure.
So it's just good, kind of practical, preventative type of procedure. If you have a risk that's high, if you have an area of the church that's higher risk, so maybe a church nursery, again, you'll want to make sure that this is done appropriately. You want to respect people's privacy, but if there's an area of the church that is maybe harder to monitor, or where you do have a lot of children, consider, obviously working with the pastor, installing some sort of appropriate surveillance technology, some sort of video camera system. That way, if there ever is a question or a concern, you can go back and look and see what exactly happened. We had a child, climb up a bookshelf and they got hurt. Well, what exactly happened? We can say, oh yes, everything was being done right. Even though this injury occurred, we could have handled that a little bit better. So just having that surveillance in place so you can address those concerns. And then the last practical step is anytime you're going to have a church activity, such as especially something off-site like a camp type of event or a get-together, some sort of recreational type of activity that's involved in ministry, is just do an assessment with some other responsible adults and say, what are the risks involved here, and how can we reduce them? Do we have enough supervisors helping us? Do we have enough volunteers? Do we have, if it's an example you see a lot in the books on this topic, if it's any type of event that involves, say, swimming, say all the girls or all the guys are getting together to have a swimming event, do we have enough lifeguards? Do we know who can swim and who can't? If it involves anything that's inherently risky, if there's things like fireworks or firearms involved, I would generally recommend against those being as part of organized church activities, just because of the inherent risk from a liability perspective. So doing that proactive assessment of an activity as it arises, to just check in with the church leadership and say, have we properly monitored this opportunity?
Excellent. This is all such great information. We certainly appreciate it. I imagine as you have watched this video, maybe you've made some mental notes. It's worth talking with the appropriate leadership that oversee your area of ministry and just having a good conversation. Yes. My hope is this video will be a great starting point. It would be wonderful if everyone watching, this is all a blank slate and no one's having to deal with issues already. Sadly, we know at some point, if you minister long enough, to some degree, there will be accidents, there will be things that happen. But we just want this information to help create that culture of awareness, like you've mentioned, and help us be proactive in our approaches. So, any final remarks in helping us?
I think at the end of the day, we have to remember that the goal of the church is to be a place that is safe, that is welcoming, that is nurturing, because we want to grow the hearts and minds of the people that come there for ministry, whether they're children or adults. And that can happen if it's an appropriate environment. And so these things, being proactive, reinforces and supports the mission of the church.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for sharing this great information. Thanks for taking part in this video. We encourage you to stay tuned to Pentecostal Publishing House for more training videos in the future.